Hi, and welcome to another episode of the Gundabad Playthrough Podcast, and I'll be continuing my Firered Normielock challenge. So what is a Nuzlocke? Essentially, a Nuzlocke is just a fan-made set of self-imposed rules to make the game even more challenging for veteran players. And there's only 3 important rules to a Nuzlocke. Rule number 1, always name your Pokemon. And rule number 2, whenever you enter a new zone, you must always attempt to capture the first Pokemon you run into, while only having 1 attempt. And rule number 3, if your Pokemon just so happen to faint to battle or poison or fire effects, those Pokemon then become unusable for the rest of the game. However, one thing that's good about a Nuzlocke is at the end of the day, I get to create and set the rules for myself. So now let me show you the full list of the rules I plan on using for this challenge. Pause the video if you need to. I like Yu-Gi-Oh! In fact, after forcing myself to learn the game, I can confirm that it's very fun. However, there's still some problems with the game, but they're not as big as I once believed they were. But looking back at my journey, seeing the steep hill that I had to climb just to learn how to play the game at a competent level was difficult. But when I turned around, I realized that the hill wasn't as steep as I thought it was. But then I had to think to myself, why did the Yu-Gi-Oh! Hill feel so much harder to climb than I originally thought? And I think I started to notice it based on the behavior of the Yu-Gi-Oh! Community and the way how they handle the game and make it hard for newcomers to get invested. And part of the reason for it is because they tend to use very vague yet kind of accurate descriptions of Yu-Gi-Oh! In its current form. You see, back in the day, Yu-Gi-Oh! Was made under the same philosophy as many other kids' toys, which was keep it simple. Essentially what it meant was that Yu-Gi-Oh! Had to be something that was easy to pick up, understand, learn, play, ending with the last step easy to master. However, keeping it simple is often a double-edged sword, and it's not like Uno in this sense that is known for being a rather complex game, arguably way more complex than Yu-Gi-Oh! 20 years ago. And part of the reason of Uno's success was literally because they dared to do something that a lot of the other games such as Yu-Gi-Oh!, Pokemon, and Magic could never have accomplished, going up to 4 players. Yes, Uno is a very fun game 1v1, but as we all know, it's by far the easiest version and can sometimes be the most boring. And the truth is because you have to draw so little cards, you almost play in very short rounds, and sometimes with no strategy. But Uno doesn't remain easy, as both its complexity and difficulty increases just by adding another player. So just by adding one more opponent to the game totally changes the dynamic of the game and adds this extra layer of complexity, even though it decreases your chances of winning, but in doing so, creates this accidental side effect in which the game becomes even more thrilling and increases the fun gauge. And since everyone was capable of using the same deck, meant that it was truly a random experience that was always fun no matter how many people you played with. And let's be real, one of the signs to know that a game is good is when you want to choke the shit out of the winner. Also, and more importantly, Uno was one of those games in which you just had to buy the box and you owned everything that you needed to play. Yu-Gi-Oh! On the other hand was this customizable 1v1 designed card game in which most of its complexity came from the fact that you had to pull random ass cards from packs. Alright, but forget that for a moment. What about the rules? Did they do a good job setting up the rules? Yes and no. And the only reason why I say no is because your target audience are retarded ass 10-year-olds and younger. And a lot of where they got the rules from was either A, the video games, or B, the TV show. Truth be told, I believe that had Yu-Gi-Oh! Stayed unchanged from the state that it released in, just like Uno, I don't think people would be remembering it this fondly. I think it would be seen as this irrelevant, boring, nostalgic card game. So yes, Yu-Gi-Oh! In its simplest form was flawed, and because it had such loosey-goosey rules, essentially it was the real life player base that was essentially doing IRL beta testing for the game. I bring up Uno because even the simplest of family tabletop games has clearly defined rules to make sure that no one can easily break the system. Now remember, Yu-Gi-Oh! Is a customizable 1v1 card game, which means that just like any other 1v1 customizable card games, you tend to see this trend in which over the years get new rulings, new cards, becomes more redefined and refined over time. But if there's something that Uno, Yu-Gi-Oh!, basketball, boxing, and chess all have in common, at the end of the day, there is a clear winner and a clear loser, and nobody wants to be the loser. However, Yu-Gi-Oh has changed, and over the years, whether it be good or bad, it's up for you to decide. However, perception can be a real bitch. You see, people tend to do this dumb thing in which they tend to remember people or things in specific ways, even when they walk away from it. And typically speaking, the first thing that you tend to remember is the last interaction that you would have had with said thing, whether it be physically, digitally, directly, or indirectly. My last interaction with Yu-Gi-Oh was when I was a kid. So here I was trying to get back into Yu-Gi-Oh all these years later, still thinking that it was some casual back and forth slow-paced game similar to the anime. And guess what? I was in for a very rude awakening. And nowadays, well, this is what it feels like to play Yu-Gi-Oh.
Read, nigga! Read!
I like that joke, and I hate how accurate that is. And let me show you what it's really like to play Yu-Gi-Oh.
Oh, wait a minute. Oh! The dream!
Once upon a time, Yu-Gi-Oh was a card game. Now I see what it really is, and that is the fact that it plays more like a fighting game in card form. When you choose an archetype, you're picking a character. And guess what? There is a difference between understanding the fundamentals of the game versus understanding the fundamentals of your character. And guess what? Just like a fighting game, whatever character you and your opponent chooses, you essentially have access to the same shit. Like jump, punch, half circle inputs for a special attack. Well, wait a minute, that's fighting games. Draw cards, set monsters, attack, special summon, cast spells, search monster spell or traps, add cards to your hand, the list goes on. With the only difference being that your character does things in a specific way according to its archetype. And instead of it being this turn based interaction, it then becomes a game of execution and understanding matchups. When you end and pass your turn, that's going into neutral. Yet new archetypes feel like DLC characters in which they can either be overtuned and become the new top tier or be well balanced duds. Ban hits feel more like character nerfs with the new release sets, and with new set releases, that's essentially just you praying and hoping that your character gets updated and gains the buffs that he deserves. And I'll be honest, had people understood this coming in, I don't think they would have been so resistant to learning / enjoying the game. But you want to know what sucks? The problem is that even fighting games are known for having this perception of being really difficult for new players to get into, meaning you're going to run into the same issue. But at the very least, new players won't be so surprised by the bullshit. Now, Yu-Gi-Oh! In perception of a new player, I understand that it is seen as a very difficult, complicated game. As a Magic player, I would argue that they're both around the same level. I think Yu-Gi-Oh! Is just a little bit more difficult, but that's only because Pokemon and Magic actually allows the player to learn at their own pace. And unlike the niggas that stuck with Yu-Gi-Oh! And got the learning curve spoon-fed to them by Konami, new players like me, on the other hand, had to take 20 years worth of knowledge and cram it into the span of now. And that is super unreasonable because it takes a lot of time for you to learn anything new, and I'm a slow learner, so it took me like a month just to feel comfortable at playing Yu-Gi-Oh! At a competent level. And that's just asking way too much from a new player. You see, I made a video on this topic a long time ago called the New Player Conundrum, and I said that even though new players are desired, new players also have an ego, and able for you to keep players attached to your game, you need to play with their egos a bit and give them easy victories, or else the current player base then become roadblocks for said new players, pushing them away and into the arms of a different game. And just by how fragile egos are for these new players, eventually they just tell themselves, oh, the game's just too overwhelming, there's too much bullshit. And what happens 8 out of 10 times? They just go for Magic or Pokemon, because naturally, people will always choose the path of least resistance. I mean, shit, it almost happened to me. I was this close to giving up, and if it wasn't for the fact that I was a fan of the original animated series, I probably wouldn't have stuck around. But the fact that knowing now that you need to come in with the mindset of kind of like trying to conquer a fighting game, being like, yes, I need to conquer this with any means necessary. Because otherwise you're going to be like Raren here and run the fuck away like a little bitch, being slowly but surely brought back by the Yu-Gi-Oh community members, slowly forging him into a Yu-Gi-Oh lover. I mean, hey, 7th time's the charm, right? Back on topic. Step 1. Pick a character. So just look at the boss monster of each archetype and pick one that looks cool. Step 2. This part is gonna suck, because step 2 requires you to look at guides to figure out combos for said character. And yes, even though I could talk about all the different forms of summons like fusions, links, synchros, exes, and tributes, the truth is that even though they might seem different on paper, their function is surprisingly similar to each other. In a fighting game, this would be called training mode, and sometimes training mode would give you a couple of combos to try and figure out the buttons and shit. And I'm not gonna lie, it will take you like a week or two to actually understand the combos and why certain things work a specific way. Just like a fighting game, you're just trying to study the behavior of your character. Which leads into step 3. There are a few characteristics that you must be willing to pay attention to. The categories are speed, defense, recovery, control, strength, last but the most important, consistency. Now, avid regular Yu-Gi-Oh players might be able to decipher the meaning behind the words that I've chosen. But if you're retarded like me, allow me to give you a translation and a full breakdown of what these words mean. In hindsight, speed is one of the poorest words I probably could have chosen, however it felt right at the time. Essentially, speed was meant for me to describe the person who was essentially going first. The question was originally how quick can you get to your end board. The real question should be how much resources do you use to reach your end board? Because for Yu-Gi-Oh that is priority number 1. Defense. Are you capable of protecting your board from your opponent's monster or playing through disruptions? If so, how many? Speaking of disruptions, now I think it's the best time to bring up hand traps. What are hand traps? Essentially, hand traps are your opponent's way, in fighting game terms, blocking or counter grab into the reversal throw. Recovery. If and when your board is destroyed, can you rebuild? And if so, how much of it can you recover? Control. How well can you dictate / maintain your board presence while slowing down your opponent's game plan? Strength. Are your monsters capable of going over your opponent's monsters or ending the game on your turn? Consistency. Are you capable of effectively going into the combos you need to create your end board? Not only does your deck need to do everything I just mentioned, but it also needs to do it well. Every archetype out there is an ATV. However, the meta decks are just amazing all-rounders that just don't give a fuck about the opponent's existence, handling any situation and playing beyond multiple disruptions, making you think, why bother? Step number 4 is figuring out your ratios. Now, it's going to be a common mistake that you're going to look at certain deck profiles and be like, oh, this is the monster to spell to trap ratio. The truth is, you're going to want to break decks down, not by those 3 categories, but by these 3 categories: starters, extenders, and interruptions. And here's kind of a good rule of thumb. If you can, try and squeeze the archetype into a 40 card deck and get as much information as you can on the archetype that you're using. Also, if anybody plays certain cards at 1, then you should keep it at 1. However, there are certain decks where you might require multiple, like 2 or 3. Buy them at 3 no matter what, and play around with the ratios that way. Now, what are the quote-unquote ratios? For starters, you should have anywhere from as low as 9 to as high as 15. And when it comes to interruptions, same thing, 9 to 15 cards. Extenders, on the other hand, are quite different because extenders depend on the type of deck you are using. And this is why I use the term ATV, because there is a big chance that some starters can also be used as extenders. They can be a part of both categories, and vice versa. There's a lot of extenders that can also be used as starters if you do not have any starters in your hand. So the real ratios for specific decks is going to be about 12 starters, 10 to 12 interruptions, and then the rest are extenders. And step number 5, grab your friend who's really knowledgeable about Yu-Gi-Oh and start playing with them. This is the playtesting phase. The only thing you're trying to do is figure out how interactions work. The truth is that for this entire time, you're not actually playing, you're learning the game. Because what you're trying to do, figure out which interruptions you can play through, figure out what interruptions stop you in your track, figure out how much you can sacrifice while still having the most optimal performance. And I know what it sounds like you're training to play like tournaments, but yeah, that's what Yu-Gi-Oh! Has turned into. And also, while we're still on the topic, hand traps. Hand traps are essentially just negate spells that you can use anytime your opponent activates a monster ability or a spell card, with the most common hand traps being Infinite Impermanence, Ash Blossom, Effect Veiler, and recently, Droll and Lockbird. Look, I understand there's like 50 others, but these are the ones that you are most likely going to run into when starting your combo. Well, I think that's it. I feel like I've hit all the major points that I need to. So to recap, new players are going to come in with an ego. However, they're not coming in with the right mindset. You need to put yourself in the mindset that this is a fighting game. You're here to learn and hopefully improve slowly. And just like a fighting game, you need to understand that it's going to be a really long journey just for you to become competent. Also, pick an archetype that looks fun to use, try to make a 40 card deck, understand ratios, learn hand traps, and the last step is try to have fun, because the truth is that it's going to take some time before you even start having fun with the game. And I know I said pick an archetype that looks fun to play, but the truth is most new players are going to want to win like right away. And even though I would like to recommend beginner-friendly brain-dead decks, the problem with Yu-Gi-Oh! Is that there's not a brain-dead enough of a deck out there that can fetch you wins, because there's just too many variables in Yu-Gi-Oh! I'm going to ask you guys a very important question, which is, if you were going to play 100 games of Yu-Gi-Oh! Like a month, right? What do you want your win-to-loss ratio to look like? My ego says I want to win 100% of the time, but I understand that's not realistic, so I am perfectly fine with a 50-50 win-to-loss ratio. However, let's be real, there are a lot of people out there that don't want to lose more than 10 games and want to have a 90% win rate. Yu-Gi-Oh! Is running into a different problem in which, able for you to get that successful like 90% win rate, guess what you need to do? You need to choose meta decks. However, there was something that I started to notice specifically about meta decks, and that was after when Farfa made a video and I watched Stevie Blunder react to Farfa make his video. He was either reacting to Farfa or MPT. The truth is that one of the things that you start to notice is that for the archetypes engine to work for these meta decks, you only need like 10 distinct cards. But guess what? Normally for a lot of the older archetypes, that is not the case at all. And that was because later on in the life cycle, creating quote-unquote archetypes became a thing. And so per archetype, you have 10 monsters to choose from, 10 spells to choose from, and like 10 traps to choose from, and then like 10 extra deck monsters to choose from. So not only does it suck that you need to read about 50 cards per old archetype, however, what about these new archetypes? Guess what? There's only like 10 cards to choose from, which makes it much easier to build a deck. For instance, Tenpai Dragon. Tenpai Dragon came with 4 monsters, 3 spells, 1 trap, 2 synchros for a total of 10 cards. Tier limits, damn near the same thing. 4 monsters, 4 spells, 2 traps, 3 fusions. Eventually, Konami would release 1 more monster for this archetype. Snake Eye / Diabellstar. It started off with 6 or 7 monster cards, eventually being increased to like 8, 3 spells, 1 trap, and 1 fusion. Eventually, they got 1 more monster and 2 more spells. Guess what? To play the engine, you only need 11 cards. 5 monsters, maybe 6, and 3, sometimes 4 spells. And you tell the fusion and trap card to fuck off. But outside of these archetypes, there was the Shizu, Razio, Fiendsmith, and others before it. And very much like DLC characters in video games, these archetypes were dominant, even after getting nerfed. The truth is that the nerfs didn't make them weaker, there was now a chink in the armor. You see, in my mind, there are overtuned, perfectly tuned, and undertuned archetypes, and all the names that I just said here fall under the category of overtuned. And guess what? If you want that 90% win rate, you are going to need to use these overtuned decks. And you know what? Let's compare a perfectly tuned deck like Tenpai Dragons versus Dark Magicians. Dark Magician teeters between being undertuned and perfectly tuned. Tenpai Dragon has 10 cards for you to look at, however, because of the ban list and the way how engines work, you need a certain amount of cards. Normally, for a perfectly tuned deck like Dark Magician, you need about 25 cards for the engine. Now, I'm not talking about 25 different cards, I mean 25 cards total. And Tenpai Dragon only needs 12, which is 30% of your deck, by the way. Now, comparing that with Dark Magician needs 23 to 25 cards, which is somewhere between 52% and 58%, meaning not only do you need to use double the amount of cards, for some fucking reason, Tenpai Dragon has a much better consistency. In fact, all of the overtuned archetypes seem to function around this 12 to 15 card range. And not only is the requirement much less, but because they can play through pretty much anything, even your end board, you wind up being in a much better position than someone who was playing a Dark Magician deck. Like, I have a Dark Magician deck, and even after doing some playtesting for a good minute there, I was only having 65 to 70% consistency, which is actually kind of bad, especially when you think about the fact that not only are you using double the cards, you're using double the cards for a less consistent deck. And it also doesn't help that the end board that you create is so much weaker than the board that your opponent was going to build. However, because the engines to a lot of these overtuned archetypes are so small, people just realize you can just slap two of these archetypes together to create the most annoying deck ever for guaranteed victory. You know, then you get something like Cheerleading Ishizu, where it's just like after reading the card text you realize there is this loose synergy between both of them, and then people were just like, oh, this creates this super deck. But then you get something like Based, remember that bullshit? Where you would just like force these archetypes to fit together and it would just work for some reason. And because a lot of these archetypes have fewer cards attached to them, guess what? A lot of these cards do very powerful things, which is kind of the reason why people started complaining about one card combos. And again, the only reason why I bring this up is because you, as a new player, are going to be facing this uphill battle. It's one of those things where it's like, this video is becoming a little bit too long, and the more that I complain, I realize that, oh, it's just, a lot of this is going to be covered in a separate video later down the line, so I think I'm kind of done ranting for right now. So yeah, so I hope y'all enjoy the video. Like, comment if you want to, I don't care. Subscribe if you feel like it. And these are just my opinions, but if you don't agree with me,
go fuck yourself.